Well, hello. This is my first time in Berlin. It's very exciting. I'm thrilled to be here. I just asked our gracious host, are Germans really on time for everything? And he said yes, because I'm from the Middle East where we're not. So I actually find a fascinating phenomenon. I came out to Berlin to share the work that has been my labor of love. And it's something my team created as a way to sort of rethink and redesign something that we think we know very well, which is the news. The way we tell stories, the way we share information, the way we consider media as a whole. What are we optimizing for as journalists? If you ask me, we're optimizing for knowledge transfer. Media is adult education. So that, plus everything we had learned in the digital domain, plus everything we've experienced as field reporters, led us to build Syria Deeply. Now I'm going to share our story. I don't usually use myself as data, but in this particular case, we are an important case study because on one hand, I think what we've done is special, and it clearly comes from a fusion of heart and mind. But even though it's special, it's not particularly unique. We're part of a growing phenomenon, a trend in digital publishing toward what we're coining as the hyper-topical news revolution. We saw hyper-local news, and now we're seeing a wave of hyper-topical news. And as we venture down this creative experience of a startup that became News Deeply, it was really a passion project that became a social enterprise that became a startup called News Deeply, we found ourselves in the middle of a bigger, broader trend that says something very potent and very sort of high potential for the future of news. So with that, I'll tell you my story. I started out, as you heard, as a television reporter for ABC News and Bloomberg. I was based in Dubai covering the Middle East. When I was 25 years old, I was with ABC News in New York. They sent me out with a camera and a backpack to cover the Islamic Republic of Iran and later, more broadly, the Arab world. So here was ABC News really trying to expand its reach into the international reporting domain by giving a 20-something all of the tools of technology and seeing what would come of it. It was amazing. It was an incredible experience, dream job, absolutely wonderful. And I found myself, certainly, heading over there, I'm now 32, in 2007 as a 25-year-old, in the midst of generational change. We talk about millennials, I'm right on the cusp. By the definition of the Pew Center's sort of demarcation of a millennial, I'm right on the line. So I was growing up in my career alongside the rise of the Arab millennials that were leading this wave ultimately of regional change. But also my career rose with the rise of Twitter. So when it came time for the Arab Spring, we really watched it unfold hashtag by hashtag. This is a hashtag timeline of how the Arab awakening happened in terms of what you were seeing. It started in Tunisia with the Sidi Bouzid uprising, essentially a young man setting himself on fire in Sidi Bouzid, that becoming Tunisia's revolution and becoming known as this hashtag Sidi Bouzid. Next came the Egyptian protests on January 25th, what came to be known as the Tahrir Revolution, February 14th in Bahrain, which became the Lulu Square uprising, February 17 in Libya, February 20th in Yemen, and finally in Syria. And what I noticed as a journalist was that because Syria came last in the order of revolutions, it got the least attention. We were all fixated on the fight to oust Muammar Gaddafi, and by the time that conflict or that storyline had sort of tapered in the international press, we had story fatigue. We were kind of done with the Arab Spring story. So when it came to Syria, I would often say we had an F11 problem. When there was a story on Syria, it was often on page F11. And if it was ever in the headlines, what happened in between the times it turned up on the front page was completely incomprehensible. I was not a Syria specialist. I'm still not a Syria specialist, but I knew a lot of Syria specialists, and more importantly, I knew a lot of Syrians. I had some personal family ties, relatives from Syria, but more importantly, I'd gotten to know the country and I really cared about what was going on there. And I noticed that there was practically no space to cover it in any of the mainstream press. It's a complicated story. By the time we checked in, this was already 6-8 months into the protests. I could tell that it was a highly consequential story with very low levels of comprehension. So here was a consequence, and here was comprehension. And I'd never seen such a vast gap. I also had this feeling that as a global press pool, we had failed coverage of the Iraq War, and not just at the beginning, but toward the end, when we were still there, and we had stopped paying attention. So I figured if we stopped paying attention to Iraq as an American press pool, generally speaking, there was a drop-off in coverage. If we weren't paying attention when we were there, we were practically lost when it came to Syria, which was already a very complicated story. So I took a pause from television. Actually, it all started when I did sort of product development without realizing it. I drew in my personal notebook, what would be the ultimate story page for Syria? If you tried to put a roof over a story, what would it look like? And that was because I had read Jane McGonigal's book, Reality is Broken. It left a huge impact on me. And she talked about user experience in such a novel way, in such an accessible way, that it got me thinking about the user experience of everything. What was the user experience of the party I just went to? What was the user experience of my ride on the subway? And she had this concept of, and I don't know if it's hers or if she was just citing it, the concept of POSX, P-O-S-X, the positive experience of something. So I started thinking of how do I enhance the user experience of the Syria story in a way that enhances POSX, makes it more accessible, makes it more of a learning journey. So I drew in my notebook what I thought would be the ideal story page for Syria. I started showing it to everyone I knew. And there was a lot of interest, but my industry couldn't really see it. So, it's a great idea, but we can't really see it. Okay. And it's really hard in a way sometimes to innovate within an industry, especially when it comes to new products and formats. So, and a lot of the foundations we spoke to early on told us we're not doing Syria. So, okay, so the industry's not going to do it, and so far the foundations aren't going to do it, so we're going to have to do it. So this is what we did. We found that because of this market failure in foreign news, essentially, we started to, chart what was going on and document why we thought a page like this was necessary. In the US, at least, it was a very simple equation. Oops. For cost cutting and all sorts of commercial reasons you're very familiar with, foreign news bureaus had largely been shuttered. 20 newspapers and news organizations had cut foreign bureaus entirely. Now, this doesn't really happen in Germany or in Europe at large. I think you just sometimes, being in Europe, you feel like you're closer to the world. But being in the US can be quite isolating if you're following US news, and US news is cutting all of its foreign bureaus. So they're starting to disappear. For similar reasons, full-time reporters reporting on the outside world were cut dramatically, from 307 full-time correspondents to 234 by 2011. And that was still, there was still some Iraq war coverage then, so that accounts for some of it. And as a result, if you did a content analysis of what was out there in the foreign press for the United States, the volume of reporting on what's happening in the world, so the raw data is just not there. So we charted that. We made the case that essentially the result of that is mass confusion and uninformed societies, and that as a result, you found that in critical moments, and we saw this last year, in critical moments like the US debate over whether to strike Syria last year, you had 45% of Americans saying that they didn't even know enough about Syria to have an opinion on whether to intervene. The US is a country that has a very low bar for having an opinion. And still, it's a fact. And still, 45% of Americans couldn't formulate an opinion based on what they knew of the world. So this is what we did. And this was, about 18 months ago, we launched Syria Deeply. We thought we should go one story with one landing page with the best possible user experience of information. It was basically a content architecture exercise. We took every type of information we thought was useful about this story and designed it. Got a great UX guy to take, literally rip that page out of my notebook and create what was, this was the beta version. We just relaunched, you can see it at SyriaDeeply.org. And the idea here was to be completely ego-free. There is no anchor person of Syria Deeply. If there's something good out there that is on someone else's website, we link to it. If there's great reporting from Syrians who would normally be considered fixers or helpers, we let them write in Arabic, and then we translate and publish. We do everything to produce high-fidelity information on what's happening in the conflict, at least whatever we can grasp. Because there are crazy cool things you can do with this information. The least we can do is start by putting it all in one place. So that was the first thing. Let's put a roof over this. And let's optimize for the user experience of the aha moment to the greatest extent possible. And let's be ego-free and collaborate with other news organizations. So we had all sorts of cool stuff, background sections. We thought, since news is adult education, we should help people understand the basics. So we had who's who, the timeline of events, understanding the key dynamics, international participation in this conflict. So if you're coming to the page for the first time, you can digest all that stuff. We had data maps of casualty counts and refugee flows to other countries. We did Google Hangouts because I believe that I, as a reporter, who have the privilege of calling up pretty much anyone and asking for 30 minutes of their time and then putting this much of it in a news report, I would rather unlock that and have the whole conversation as a Google Hangout and let anyone who's wonky enough like I am to be interested watch all 30 minutes of that interview and then select from it as needed for the other pieces of content. We had a fantastic time with that and a really great user response. We had Google News boxes and Twitter feeds of hand-picked folks that we thought would be useful to watch, because as long as I find, as long as you sequester different types of information, people will understand that it's distinct. Our original reporting is not the same fidelity as any one tweet. But collectively, watching those tweets has a very high value. It has a predictive effect, and it's more comprehensive than any one news outlet. You know that already. But I thought it was useful to put it on the page. So the impact was that we functionally hacked the news cycle. And what do I mean by that? We were able to become an engine for covering this story. And then we found lots of news organizations eager and willing to use our reporting to either go out and duplicate it, or quote us, or carry our pieces. We're Creative Commons licensed, so we were built for that. But as a result, to whatever extent we could, and I'm not saying we changed it overnight, we were able to have a discernible impact on how people see and engage and grasp and cover and publish anything about this conflict that we thought was worth paying attention to. Now, this is the most uncomfortable part of my presentation, because I have to show you how people said nice things about us, and that makes me a little uncomfortable. But I think it's important because we really thought we were going to labor in obscurity. I was pretty sure I was told I was basically taking on a career killer by putting aside a really valuable job in television to build a website. I think that was my mother talking, actually. You left television to build a website. Yes. That is what I did. So that's actually when we launched the thing that people picked up on most. What? And our industry, again, really didn't get it. So the fact that then people came around and started saying really nice things, on one hand, really doesn't matter. On the other hand, was really instructive. And I think just gave us a lot more courage to bet on ourselves the next time around, even if they don't say nice things at the end. So nice things, thank you, time. Nice things, nice, thanks, Fast Company, nice things. Oh, this matters. Because when it did come time for that national debate over whether to strike, it's a really awkward picture, MSNBC and others put us out. There's the only one I got, there's the only one they gave me. But it's illustrative, because when it came time to have that national debate, we were able to serve as a resource. They were able to wheel us out, literally, and put us out there into the public domain to feed in whatever we had learned, whatever data we had captured as a sort of institutional living memory of what had happened in this conflict that now suddenly we all have to care about for 10 days. And then essentially the notion that technology can, yes, revolutionize the way we explain something, the way we engage something. The fact that there wasn't enough real estate on television or even on page in the newspapers except for F11 to talk about what's going on here. We have infinite real estate. I don't need to press that point here, but I think it's really the driver of filling in the blanks. So that became our calling card. We cover what's missing. We cover what matters. And we're not out to do this to change anything except accessibility of information. So with that, come on now. All these nice things people said, thank you. But the impressive thing was how many news outlets ended up picking up the coverage, which speaks to the point of being able to hack how people engage this kind of information. And that was the greatest point of impact as far as we're concerned. Secretary of State John Kerry did a Google Hangout with us. We roped in the New York Times, and we basically had 38 minutes of conversation on YouTube before he went off to Geneva to negotiate the now somewhat wayward chemical weapons disarmament deal with Russia. It was 38 minutes of State Department time. And that was really valuable. We, again, were able to crack open the eggshell of an interview that would have otherwise had this much less than 38 minutes on even cable television. So the way we see the world now is through the lens of complex issues. Because as soon as we launched Syria Deeply, literally that day, people came to us asking, can you do Congo deeply and Catalonia deeply and Nigeria deeply, et cetera, et cetera. So we started grouping them up. I see them as species-level issues. What are the issues that affect us as a species that are frankly already difficult to capture in a single story, in a single 800-word article, but are even more difficult to cover when whole topics are dropping off the edge of the news desk because we don't have the money to cover them? So we group them into geographics, Congo deeply, Myanmar deeply, Pakistan deeply. I personally feel that conflict zones and states in transition need extra attention. They need consistent coverage. So a page is actually a good way to go. Strategic issues like poverty deeply, nuclear disarmament deeply, and science, technology, and public health. I know that's a big bucket, but we needed a bucket to put these in. People talk to us about everything from oceans deeply to Alzheimer's deeply, and we've just announced that the next one we're doing, and we are doing this slowly so that we get it right and we don't rush. Slow startup is what we're doing. Is going to be Arctic deeply. Because the Arctic is an issue that friends of ours who are expert in the issue came to us and said it has all the same problems as Syria. It's not getting coverage, it's extremely consequential, and no one really comprehends what's going on. So the idea for us, we built a 2x2 matrix, of course, and on one axis was the need for information, and on the other axis was the opportunity for impact. I didn't put it in the presentation. I will next year, I promise. So we looked at issues and we charted out issues, and we got even more granular on what those two things mean. But we looked for issues that have a high need for information and a high opportunity for impact. And I felt that Arctic was one of them, and it's a really critical time. It's a bellwether for global warming, and we thought that it would be a good one to take on. Oh, thank you. So the goal here, I feel like I missed something. 10, okay. So for every deeply, we are building a teach deeply. So we had a lot of social studies teachers in America tell us that they're using Syria Deeply in the classroom to teach their students at grade 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, what's going on in the world, what's going on with Syria. And when we presented to the National Association of Social Studies Teachers, they said, can you please do Teach Afghanistan next? Because we have a lot of students whose parents are deployed in Afghanistan, and we can't explain why. Because when the news fills the public, the teachers can't teach the students. So we actually had to step in and try to hack that as well. It's very easy, it's an easy hack, because right now every teacher that in the US who wants to teach their students what's up literally constructs it on their own. And there are a lot of services, and there's accessibility, but money ends up being the barrier, because there are two types of schools, schools with money and schools without money. And the schools with money have access to the world, and the schools without money don't. So if a lot of services are producing this kind of stuff, but charging teachers $200 per lesson plan around such and such topic. And that's fine if you're building a business model, but it's not fine if you're optimizing for the number of teachers who put this in front of the number of students. So I think, frankly, media in a way has an optimization problem. Content maybe has an optimization problem. And that's when you have to pause and ask yourself why you're doing what you're doing. And if standing in front of a TV camera is achieving that, or if building something new is a better way forward. So that is how we're keeping our commitment to the story. We've spent 18 months as a startup not scaling because I care about Syria. We got so much pressure so early to, oh my gosh, you could blank, blank, blank with this. You could grow this way with that. You could revolutionize this with that. I don't care. I care about getting it right on Syria. And I know that when we get it right on Syria, we will be able to scale it much more sustainably to everything else. Grow fast seems to be this weird startup-like default, but it wouldn't work for us. So I really had to slow down the train, and that I stopped drinking coffee, actually, that helped. But you had to do everything possible to stay true to what you were building in the first place. So that's our story, but it's not ours alone. We were approached by Columbia University to study this phenomenon that we became part of. So at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism, we've been fellows studying, in specific, the single subject news model. And again, it's not just us. You have incredible people who came before us. Everyone from Politico, clearly grew up to be very big, to Tehran Bureau, to Archinect, to Crime Watch, Homicide Watch. They do all of the crime tracking in the city of Washington, D.C. So what we found is that we are part of this broader trend toward hyper-topical publishing, vertical news as a whole, and especially salient, we're part of this phenomenon of journalists becoming entrepreneurs. Maybe because the media industry isn't doing R&D or product development the way other industries are doing. But it's become a fascinating space for that reason alone. You see a lot of incumbents learning from the startups that are publishing vertically. So yes, Politico, but now other news outlets really taking a second look at how they publish verticals and how they do or don't invest in the story page. And that's part of the impact here. But it's also led people like me to speak in front of people like you, because as journalists become entrepreneurs, they face a very daunting challenge of fusing newsroom skills with startup skills, maintaining everything we need to maintain for editorial credibility and quality of content with lean startup methodology, the capacity to manage, the capacity to project manage, the capacity to self-manage. These things are not inherent to being a journalist. We're actually kind of a basket case culture. I think it's been a really good discipline to put those two together. But there are a lot of us, and like the teachers, we're all kind of laboring alone. So the Columbia study was a lot about learning the best practices of what journalists are doing in this space. The startup newsroom is often hyper-topical because a journalist will break away to start something in the domain they know best. That's why News Deeply starts with Syria Deeply, et cetera, et cetera. I really encourage you to watch this, to read up, to see if you have a passion point and if someone is publishing around your passion point, because they'll probably be your new first place to go in the morning. But separately and independently, I hope this is something that inspires, in a way, a rethink around the user experience of what you think you know. How can it change? How can it be better? What are you optimizing for? And how do you design for what you're optimizing for, even if your industry thinks you're nuts? Thank you.
Lara, thank you very much. I think we have one question. We have a few minutes left, so
a few minutes left.
Are there any questions? Your chance. Okay, yeah.
So thank you. Are you planning something like NSA Deeply or Privacy Deeply?
We've thought about Privacy Deeply. It's not something I know. It's not my thing. So it usually happens, and it should probably happen more systematically, that people who know it best don't have a platform. In a lot of cases, people who know something well and feel like it's missing from the news cycle just build it themselves. In other cases, they come to us and say, listen, I'm expert in X, let's make a platform happen. Apropos to our last speaker, we were approached about robotics, because robotics and AI are moving further faster than our conversation about them, basically. So it's been on our mind, but it hasn't been our thing, so it hasn't been triggered just yet.
Okay, so it seems like I'm having a micro. So I think it's a great project. It's really amazing what you've built up, and I totally appreciate it. I think we need more people like you. It's really inspiring what you say. Just from a business point of view, I'm wondering, how do you plan on financing this? Or are you already earning money with that? Because basically that's the problem, that people are not willing to pay for that, right? So I was wondering about your ideas on that.
So we're revenue positive. We were revenue positive in our first year. And we were revenue positive largely because people loved our design. And then think tanks and institutions and universities asked us to build things for them based on our design. So our alternate revenue stream was around sort of tech and design-driven consulting. So we've built other people's systems for convening people around a single issue. So that's how we kept the lights on. And that was our business model to begin with, because it was the only thing we could see initially. Single subject models, and this is part of our paper, we've published the preliminary results. If you search for the single subject news, just search single subject news and Columbia, our preliminary report will come up, and then we're publishing a longer one later this year. And what we found is that publishers who go deep on a single topic have more than a few revenue streams available to them. And right now it's been done ad hoc. This is why we're publishing the report, because every startup is, and they range from one guy who's obsessed with something and doing it on the side of his day job, to a team like ours where we have 6 people dedicated to maintaining this site. Everyone is reaching for the revenue that is closest within reach. For some people, it's live events. For others, it's membership and member services. So how do you tier that? $10, and it's often not subscription, because as a startup, they don't want to block themselves off. Very few of them instituted paywalls over time, but some did. North Korea News did, a few others, right? But there are a lot of options. So those are the kinds of things they're doing. Live events, actually have the full list I'll touch on. But I'll tell you what they're not doing. They're not doing traditional ad revenue, because they have found it more worthwhile to, obviously, not to monetize traffic, but to monetize engagement. So not to monetize content, but to monetize community and what you offer to that community. And that's part of a bigger trend within the news world, and that's noticeable within the industry numbers that the Pew Center just published in their State of the Media report, State of the News report. They call it alternative revenue or audience revenue, as opposed to advertising revenue. So everything you can derive, frankly, from providing a service to the audience. Thank you. So whether that is a live event or a stream of monthly conference calls that are interesting, that people subscribe to and then can be part of, whatever, it gets very creative. So everything from foundation grants, not surprising, live events, crowdfunding, merchandising. North Korea News made a whole deck of cards around like Kim Jong-il or something, but it worked. Earned revenue, so external projects like we're doing. That's Ushahidi's model. We borrowed their business model. They were early partners, where you have an external projects team and that funds the house projects that you incubate. Subscriptions and freemium models, and then markets and job boards. There's an education news site called Chalkbeat in the United States that found that there's such a strong talent demand for teachers that if they put a job board next to their education news site, they were able to make significant revenue from that. So it's really audience-derived revenue. It does require some R&D, but there's more hope in that space, and there's more revenue for quality content than I think we've ever really realized.
Thank you very much, Lara. Thank you. Applause.